Hello, friends, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us at this program today. Are we really in mourning for the temple? And if not, what's the point of Tisha B'Av? So this is a really powerful question and very relevant because Tisha B'Av is coming up in less than 2 weeks. And we're looking forward to that learning with you during this 3 weeks period where we're in mourning for, maybe different things, but for hate in the world, for destruction, whatever it may be, our distancing from our best nature. And we're here today with a great educator, Rabbi Micah Streiffer, who is a rabbi and teacher and writer and lifelong student and is known for his engaging style in the classroom and his ability to make Jewish texts and ideas come to life. Micah is the founder of LAASOK, a virtual Beit Midrash, house of study, that empowers liberal Jewish learners to deepen their connection with Judaism through study. He also serves Kol Ami, a Reformed congregation in the Toronto area, and hosts the popular 7 Minute Torah podcast. Ordained a rabbi at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, the Reformed Rabbinical School, Cincinnati, 2007. Micah has served as a congregational rabbi for 16 years. He's currently pursuing a Ph.D. in Jewish thought, in modern Jewish thought at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Rabbi Streiffer, welcome. Thank you. It's great to have you back with us.
Thank you. My pleasure. I want to thank Rabbi Shmuley and all the staff at Valley Beit Midrash and all of you for inviting me here to study with you. And I'll just mention that Reb Shmuley is going to teach a class for LAASOK, which is the Beit Midrash that I run, in a few months. So we'll have some information about that coming up later. And I'm really excited to be here with all of you. So I am currently at summer camp. As rabbis do, I'm spending the week as faculty at URJ Camp George, which is the Reformed Jewish camp in Ontario, Lake Country. So you get the sweaty t-shirt version of me today in this unair-conditioned room with my giant water bottle and another t-shirt to wipe my sweat. So I'll beg your forgiveness. I'm also not on my own computer. I teach online all the time, but of course, whenever you're on somebody else's computer, something goes wrong. So hopefully all will be well today, technology-wise. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I appreciate the framing that Reb Shmuley just gave, because of course we are in what's called the 3 weeks, which is the period of time leading up to Tisha B'Av, which is a period of great sadness on our Jewish calendar. And one of the questions we're going to ask ourselves today is, what are we so sad about? Are we in mourning for the temple? And if not, what is the point of Tisha B'Av, this day of mourning that's coming up in less than 2 weeks? Now, I do intend this as a discussion. I know the usual format is 45 minutes of lecture and then 15 minutes of Q&A. I'm really happy for you to ask your questions at any point. I'm going to put some text in front of us, and I just want to do some good old-fashioned text study together as we make our way through. So I would invite you either to raise your hand. There's not that many of us, so if you just wave at me, I'll see you, and I'm happy for you to talk. Or you can raise your hand electronically, or you can put ideas into the chat, and I will just make sure that I have the chat feature open here so that I can see what comes up there as well. So I'm going to share my screen here, and you'll be able to see the document that we're going to work through together. So I thought we'd start with a little singing of this passage from the book of Eicha, or Lamentations. We're going to read it. We're going to read parts of it in a few moments together, but it's good to begin with at least a little bit of ritual. This is something that we sing together on Tisha B'Av, which of course isn't today, but it's coming up. And then once we sing it, we'll break it down and we'll talk about what it means. From the words of Lamentations chapter 5, verse 21. And actually, I'll put the notes up for those who can read music so you can sing along with me. Ashivenu Adonai elecha Venashuva Kadesh Kadesh, Kadesh, Yameinu Kekedem. Kadesh, 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 Yameinu Kekedem. So I wonder, we'll go back to the meaning of these words. It means in Hebrew, return us to you, Adonai. Renew our days as of old. And I want to give us a chance to just respond to these words. Respond either to what they mean or to the melody. What does this phrase bring up for you as you look at it, as you hear it sung, as you sing it? You can put that into the chat, or if anybody wants to raise your hand and respond and unmute, you can do that as well. We'll give people a minute to put a phrase into the chat about what does this song, this reading, this passage bring up for you? Return us to you, Adonai, and we will return. Renew our days as of old. These words come from the book of Lamentations, which is the book that is traditionally read on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, of course, and we'll talk about this more deeply, is the day that commemorates the destruction of the temple. In fact, in Jewish tradition, the destructions of both temples. Toby has put into our chat that this brings up for Toby a desire to return to communal and personal holiness. And I'll just add the word tshuva, the word return, which is, of course, that's one of the major themes of the High Holy Days. In some ways, Tisha B'Av is the beginning of the High Holy Days. I always say that we Jews like to begin before we begin. So when do the holidays start? Rosh Hashanah, of course, right? But there's a whole month before Rosh Hashanah of Elul, which is a month of preparation for the high holidays. And and even before Elul, we have Tisha B'Av, which is the day that begins us preparing for the preparation. So we're now only 7 weeks, I guess at this point, 8.5 weeks out from the high holy days. Your rabbis and cantors are quaking in their boots right now because they know that they need to get their sermons and their musical notations and everything ready because the high holy days are coming. And as we begin to sing these words, we note the language of return. Toby put it into the chat, and it also appears right here. Return us to you, Adonai. Hashivenu. We want to be able to do tshuva, but we need you, God, to help us return. What always jumps out at me about this passage is the language of renewal and old, all in the same phrase. I want to take a really close look at that phrase right there. Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. Renew our days as of old. We sing it as if it's just, a pretty song. But what's weird about that phrase? It actually has a contradiction in it. If you renew something, it is not old. It is new. And if you make something new, and if you go back to the way something was, if it is old, then it is not new, right? So how could something be both renewed and old? How could we ask that our days, our lives be renewed as if they were old? And so that's a reminder, or it's actually a hint to us that Tisha B'Av is both backwards and forwards looking all at the same time. That somehow, and we'll see what the somehow is as we work our way through these texts, this day of Tisha B'Av wants us to look back to the way things were and also look forward to the way things could be, ought to be. And then in some way, those are actually not different actions. They are the same action. And let me look now at what Vania says in the chat. If we are being returned to Adonai, and we will return to Adonai. How are we being returned to God? I'm confused about the order of these steps. So I think that's exactly the question here, right? Is what is the order? Who is doing what? And we're not going to get too deeply into the meaning of Hashivenu. That's really a high holiday question in many ways. But it begins with Tisha B'Av, right? Tisha B'Av is the beginning of the process of return that we're undergoing here. I see a question from Michael. Go ahead, Michael.
I think this is a question that's particularly relevant now and what Israel has been going through in the last year, and it's the military versus the spiritual versus the moral, and I think this is like I said, particularly relevant. I have a son who's a lady with 7 grandkids there. So it's something that we follow very closely in thinking through these questions and what is Israel the secular state for Jews? Israel the religious? I mean, there's no easy answers, although I guess there rarely are.
Yeah, I appreciate that framing, because we really are asking ourselves the question here of, are we looking to return to something? And the temple in many ways is the symbol of the something, right? Or are we looking to create something new? And in what ways does the old help us to create the new? In what ways do we we as modern Jews have a foot in what is ancient while also looking to what is new? So I want to look in a little more depth now at the Book of Lamentations. On Tisha B'Av, I encourage you to go and hear this chanted somewhere, because that, of course, is the primary ritual of Tisha B'Av. But for now, we're going to take a look at it in English. In English, in Hebrew, Lamentations is called Echa. Echa, the word Echa in modern Hebrew would say Ech. Ech means how. But the word Echa has a resonance not only of how, but how, right? When you cry to the heavens, how could it be? How could the city sit empty? Alas, is how this is often translated. And so as I read my way through these couple of verses of Echa, I want us to ask ourselves the question of what are we in mourning for? What is the message of this ancient text? It says, alas, or as I said, it means how. Lonely sits the city once great with people. She that was great among nations is become like a widow. The princess among states is become a thrall. A thrall, by the way, is a slave. It's another word for a slave. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There is none to comfort her of all her friends. All her allies have betrayed her. They have become her foes. Judah has gone into exile because of misery and harsh oppression. When she settled among the nations, she found no rest. All her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places. Zion's roads are in mourning, empty of festival pilgrims. All her gates are deserted. Her priests sigh. Her maidens are unhappy. She is utterly disconsolate. Her enemies are now the masters. Her foes are at ease because the Lord, the Eternal, has afflicted her. For her many transgressions, her infants have gone into captivity before the enemy. So, okay, what is the message of this book of Lamentations that we read traditionally on Tisha B'Av? What is it? What is it mourning for? What is the message here? And does it resonate with you? I'm happy for anybody who wants to unmute and respond to the words of Echa or Lamentations here. What's it saying, and does it resonate with you? I'll suggest that the book that we're reading here is largely focused on the particular destruction of Jerusalem. So if this book sounds like it was written by someone in exile, in fact, it even mentions exile right here, Judah has gone into exile, that's because it was. The book of Lamentations is traditionally assumed to have been written by the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is an interesting prophet. My oldest son's name is Jeremiah, so I have a particular affinity for the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is one of the prophets who sees the destruction of the temple. He lived during the final years of the kingdom of Judah, under the final kings of Judah. He prophesied, he foretold that because of the people's actions, the city would be destroyed, the temple would be destroyed. And then he witnessed the destruction of the temple. And then for various reasons and political machinations that I won't go into right now, he finds himself in exile in Egypt, not in Babylonia where most of the Jews ended up, but in Egypt. And he then prophesies from Egypt, lamenting the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And although we don't know for sure that Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations, scholars believe that there's a very good chance that that is the case, because the book of Lamentations matches both the style and the message of Jeremiah. And the message here is very clearly a message of mourning, a message of mourning for the destruction of the temple. Just pointing out some of the interesting language here. The princess has become a thrall. The princess here, being the city of Jerusalem, has become a thrall, has become a slave to a foreign master. Bitterly she weeps in the night. Why is she weeping? She's weeping for her exiled children. And we see this kind of language elsewhere in the Tanakh as well. That the city sits empty, it sits while her people are in exile, because, of course, as it says later, Judah has gone into exile. Her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places, and that's really interesting, because the word narrow places in Hebrew is Mitzrayim. You might recognize the word Mitzrayim. What does it mean in English? Egypt, right? So there's a hint here that we're talking about Egypt. And Egypt, by the way, is a symbol in Jewish tradition of exile. It's a symbol of slavery, for a good reason, because that is the story of who we are and where we come from. We come from slavery in Egypt, and Jeremiah, sitting in Egypt after the destruction of the temple, says, look where we are, right back where we started, in slavery in Egypt. Most of the Jews are not literally in Egypt, which is why he suggests it with a hint here through the word Metzarim, the narrow places. The literal Egypt could be one of these narrow places, but so could Babylonia be one of these narrow places, and so could any other place where Jews find themselves in exile. And for the last 2,000 years, Jews have understood themselves to be in exile. No matter where we lived, we are in exile. We're in exile in Babylonia. We're in exile in Spain. We're in exile in Ashkenaz, which is that, Germany, Rhine Valley, which spreads out into Poland and the Pale of Settlement. We're in exile in America. We're in exile in Canada. No matter where we are, no matter where we go, we Jews are in exile. Even those Jews who lived in the land of Israel understood themselves to be in exile. Why? Because the Messiah had not come, and the temple had not yet been rebuilt. And so Jeremiah is lamenting something here that almost every Jew in history could relate to, and that is living in exile. And one of the things we have to ask ourselves, and I'll invite you to think about this, and I'll ask you later for an answer, is, do you consider yourself to be in exile? Do you think of yourself as being in exile as a Jew? Don't answer that yet. We'll come back to that. So what sits at the center of Tisha B'Av is the mourning for the destruction of the temple. But Tisha B'Av is about more than the temple itself. It is about a variety of tragedies and destructions that happened throughout Jewish history. And we read about that here in this Mishnah, Mishnah Ta'anit, chapter 4, Mishnah number 6. The Mishnah is a Jewish code of law that's written in around the year 200. This is already after the destruction of the second temple in the year 70. The rabbis, who are in their infancy at this time, get together to begin to bring together all of the texts, traditions, stories, laws that they felt needed to be captured, and to bring them together into a code of law that could be gathered and transmitted and carried around the world for the Jews to continue their Jewish life in the shadow of the temple, once there is no more temple and no more Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. And what do we read about Tisha B'Av? On the 9th of Av, by the way, Tisha B'Av simply means the 9th of Av. It's like the 4th of July, right? The name of the holiday is simply the date, the 9th of Av. What happened on the 9th of Av that we are in mourning for this day? Well, a few things. It was decreed upon our ancestors that they would not enter the land. That's a reference to a parsha that we read about a month ago, which is Shlach Lecha, the story of the spies. Anybody remember the story of the spies from the Torah? Moses sends these spies in to scout out the land of Israel. Scouts is a better word for it, really. To scout out the land of Israel, and the scouts come back and they say, oh, it's big and scary. We don't think we can do it. And the people all go crazy and they say, God, return us to Egypt. We don't want to be here anymore. How dare you take us out of Egypt, out of that land flowing with milk and honey. They refer to the land of Egypt as like a land filled with good things. How dare you take us out here into the desert? And God says, all right, you don't want to go back into the promised land? Forget about it. You're going to wander in the desert for the next 40 years. So the rabbis say that that happened on Tisha B'Av. That was the first major tragedy of Tisha B'Av. What else happened on Tisha B'Av? The temple was destroyed the first time and the second time. The first time in the year 586 BCE by the Babylonians. The second time in the year 70 CE by the Romans in the midst of what we call the Great Revolt, or the Jewish Revolt against Rome. Both times the Jews are sent into exile in some way. Both times represent a loss of sovereignty, a loss of the of a sovereign Jewish political and religious entity in Israel. So when we talk about the destruction of the temple, we're not only talking about the razing of a building, we're talking about a transformation of Jewish life, the loss of sovereignty, and the sending of our people, or at least a significant number of our people, away from the land that we have held to be our own. Twice, first time and second time. So that's three tragedies. What else happened? Beitar was captured. Beitar was the last stronghold of what's called the Bar Kokhba revolt. Anybody familiar with the Bar Kokhba revolt? Is that something you're familiar with? I see a couple of heads shaking. Bar Kokhba revolt happens about 50 or 70 years after the destruction of the temple in the 130s, 132 to 135, I think, where the Jews again rebelled against Rome. It's very possible, I've been reading about this week actually, it's very possible that for a very short time they recaptured Jerusalem, they restarted sacrifices in the ruins of the temple, maybe, we don't know for sure, and then the Romans came in and crushed the revolt again. And the last stronghold of this final gasp of Jewish sovereignty in the land was at a place called Beitar. And so Beitar, when was Beitar captured? On the 9th of Av. And finally, the city of Jerusalem was plowed at the end of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Jews were forbidden from entering Jerusalem. Jerusalem was plowed over and turned into a pagan city called Aelia Capitolina. And it was the end of an era. So 5 things happen on the 9th of Av. All 5 things relate in some way to our being in the land and to the destruction of the possibility of Jewish sovereignty in the land, whether it's in the Torah when we are decreed not to enter, whether it's the destruction of the first or second temples, or the crushing of the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the exclusion of Jews from the city of Jerusalem. There are, by the way, other calamities that occurred on the 9th of Av, and I have a listing of some of them here. The expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290, the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, interestingly also occurred on Tisha B'Av. Germany's declaration of war on Russia occurred on Tisha B'Av in 48. That's not the beginning of World War II, but it's a major escalation of World War II. And the first transports to reach Treblinka happened on Tisha B'Av. So Tisha B'Av becomes this overall day of mourning. We pile them on Tisha B'Av. Now, I can't say whether, historically speaking, all these things actually happened on Tisha B'Av. Right? The rabbis are a little bit prone to hyperbole. The rabbis like to make things neat and tidy sometimes, except when they like to make things messy and complicated. But in this case, they're making things neat and tidy and saying, look at all of these things happened on Tisha B'Av. I don't know that for sure, but that might be, for all we know, that's rabbinic mythology, that this all happened. And yet, we as a people have turned Tisha B'Av into a day to remember all these things that have to do with sovereignty, that have to do with our expulsion from our land and the destruction of our temple. And what sits at the center of all that is the temple, the destruction of the religious and spiritual center of Jewish life. What went on in the temple? Animal sacrifice, the priestly biblical religion that sometimes we call it, First Temple period Judaism. The word Judaism is a little bit of an anachronism, but Judaism is born out of what goes on in the temple. And once the temple is no more, all of that is lost. The priesthood is reduced to a shadow of its former self. Yes, there are still Kohanim. I don't know if anybody here is a Kohen. There are still people who understand themselves to be Kohanim, but the Kohanim used to be a spiritual and political force in Jewish life. Today, the Kohanim are the people that get to the first Aliyah, and they bless the community and they get their hands washed, right? So it's reduced to a shadow of what it once was. We used to have a giant, beautiful spiritual center in Jerusalem, and it's gone. And Judaism must now adapt. The centrality of the temple in Judaism is best expressed through our prayer book. Before I go on and I show you how the prayer book expresses the centrality of the ancient temple in Judaism, I just want to stop and ask if there are any questions, comments, reactions to anything that I've said or that we've looked at so far. Any thoughts at this point? Okay, so let's go on a little bit here. We're going to look at the traditional Amidah, the traditional prayer book, what we would call today the Orthodox prayer book, because this is different in a Reform or conservative, somewhat prayer book, depending on Reconstructionist. I'm a Reform rabbi, and I recognize that we're a pluralistic group here. So it's worth looking at what are the traditional prayers and how do they express our longing for the temple. Remember, our primary question here is, are we really in mourning for the temple? Well, according to our prayer book, we are. What do we say every day, 3 times a day? I'll just read these. Sound upon the great shofar for our freedom and raise the banner to gather our exiles. Gather us together from the 4 corners of the earth. Blessed are you, eternal, who gathers together the dispersed of God's people of Israel. So a blessing for the regathering of the people of Israel back to the land of Israel with the language of exile and the language of the sounding of a great shofar for our freedom. So that's one element. Next element, restore our judges, it says, as in the beginning, and our counselors as in the beginning time. Remove from us sorrow and groaning and reign over us, you, O God alone, and in loving kindness and mercy, justify us in judgment, which actually literally means something like vindicate us, God, like fight our wars for us. So we're asking for a return to political sovereignty here. When it says restore our judges, that means leaders who would sit judicially over the people of Israel. That's what we're asking to be restored here. Then we get more specific. Then we get to Jerusalem. To Jerusalem, your city, may you return with mercy and dwell in the midst of it as you have spoken, and build it soon and in our day as an eternal structure, and quickly establish the throne of David. Blessed are you, Adonai, builder of Jerusalem. So we've asked for a return of exiles. We've asked for a return of judges. We've asked for a rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. And then I'll just jump down here to this last one, because now we really drill down to the temple, where we ask God, be pleased, Adonai, or eternal our God, with your people Israel and with their prayer, and restore the service of the holy temple. What does it mean, the service of the holy temple? It means sacrifice in the ancient temple. So we are in the end asking God to restore the temple, the city of Jerusalem, and all the trappings that come along with it. At the center of all of this sits the temple. Now, I want to now ask you the question that I asked you before. Looking at these prayers, I know we don't have the whole thing on the screen at the same time, but we can at least get Jerusalem and we can get Holy Temple. These are the prayers that Jews have said 3 times a day for the last 2,000 years. Now, that's not a little bit, right? You say these words 3 times a day for the last 2,000 years. You got to really mean it, right? These are the words that the rabbis want us to internalize, that the rabbis want us to be thinking about, because as far as they're concerned, this sits at the center of Judaism, the desire to return and rebuild the temple. So now I'll ask you the question I asked before. Do you consider yourself to be in mourning for the temple? What do you think? Does this idea resonate with you? Do you want to be praying 3 times a day, God, rebuild the temple and return us to the service as it was, the sacrifice as it was in the ancient temple? Who do you want that? Anybody here looking for that? And I have no particular, there's not a particularly right or wrong answer here. How about just a thumbs up or a thumbs down? Oh, Vanya, go ahead, please.
I don't know that I want that. I mean, this is like us being in mourning for the past, and it's impossible for us to go back and live in the past. So I agree with the prayers and everything else, but I don't believe in the legitimacy of them or like the accuracy of them,
So like the literal rebuilding. You're not looking for a literal.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. I appreciate that comment. Ellen, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. Isn't rebuilding the temple, though, one of the criteria for the coming of Mashiach?
So in traditional Judaism, the coming of Messiah is associated with the rebuilding of the temple. What order that'll all happen is a question, right? Will the Messiah come and then rebuild the temple, or is the temple rebuilt as a part of the Messiah coming? So yes, it's part of this larger sort of messianic scenario that brings about a return to sovereignty and and the coming of the messianic time. So tell me why do you bring that up?
Well, it was what you started earlier as far as you pose the question, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but do any of us look to the return to the temple and all from the beginning prayer that was read? I'm not connecting the dots very well, so maybe you can help me.
Yeah,
the question was.
My question, well, let's see. I was asking, do we connect with the idea of wanting to return, right?
Right, and that to me is when I thought of Mashiach as far as the return. That would to me it was the return would be heralded as far as with the return of Mashiach. So that's how I connected it.
Good. So maybe there is something larger going on here, right? So it's interesting because a lot of us struggle with the idea of temple, right? And we're going to see in a moment some funny ways. Now it is a little funny. You'll see that it's like strange ways that Jews have tried to deal with this contradiction of, are we really in mourning for the temple, and yet Tisha B'Av is a day of both sadness and hope, sadness of what happened and hope for what could be, all at the same time. And so as we turn, I want to use as a frame for this 2 texts that come from Maimonides. Maimonides is having the same struggle that Ellen just brought up. Maimonides you'll see what Maimonides says. Maimonides is a 12th century Jewish philosopher, legalist. He's a rabbi. He's a physician. He writes on law. I've heard it said before that Maimonides. I said this in my last Valley Beit Midrash class, but I'm going to say it again because it's still a good joke. Maimonides is exactly who you want to bring home to your Jewish mother, because he's both a doctor and a lawyer at the same time. So Maimonides writes. He wrote many things, but among other things, he wrote a very important code of Jewish law called the Mishnah Torah, which we have in front of us. And he also wrote a very important book of Jewish philosophy called the Guide of the Perplexed, which we also have in front of us. And my question for you as we go through these 2 texts is, does Maimonides want to rebuild the temple? And you'll see that it's not so simple. So in the Mishnah Torah, in his code of Jewish law, how should Jews behave, he writes, it is a positive commandment to construct, and we might read here, rebuild a house for God, prepared for sacrifices to be offered within. We must celebrate there 3 times a year. As it states in Exodus 25, you shall make me a sanctuary. Va'asu li mikdash. And then he says, well, it doesn't matter what else he says. So Maimonides has given us a commandment to rebuild the temple. He said he doesn't mean it now, right? He means, as Ellen points out, he means in Messianic times that the temple will be rebuilt and we will again sacrifice. It's a mitzvah. It's something that we are commanded to do as Jews. And then, confusingly, he writes the following. He said, this is a little long, but I think it's worth reading. He says, consider how a baby animal gradually grows stronger and can be weaned from its mother's milk. What does this have to do with the temple? You'll see in just a second. Think of an animal that needs to be slowly, or a human actually, that needs to be slowly weaned from its mother's milk. He says many precepts of our law are the result of a similar course adopted by the Supreme Being. In other words, God is treating us like a calf that needs to be slowly weaned from something. What is the something that we need to be slowly weaned from? Well, the custom which in those days was general among all people, and the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought up, consisted in sacrificing animals in those temples which contained certain images, to bow down to those images and to burn incense before them. In other words, what did ancient people know how to do, Maimonides says? They knew how to sacrifice animals. It was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God, as displayed in the whole creation, that God did not command us to give up and to discontinue all these manners of sacrifice. For to obey such a commandment would have been contrary to the nature of man, who generally cleaves to that which he is used to. In other words, Maimonides says, let's just say that Moses had gotten up and said, okay, people, we're no longer going to sacrifice. Now we're going to pray 3 times a day. Or better yet, we're going to do mindfulness meditation every morning at sunset and every evening. That's how we're going to connect with God from now on. What would the people have done? They would have booed Moses off the stage because people like what they're used to. So Maimonides says, Moses taught the people how to sacrifice to God because what they were used to was sacrificing to other gods. So in so doing, God transferred, I don't think of God as a he, but that's the language Maimonides is using. God transferred, or he transferred to his service that which had been formerly served as a worship of created beings and of things imaginary and unreal. In other words, God transfers to God's own self what people had been doing for other people. God made that temple for us. We needed a temple so that we could learn how to worship God. And then Maimonides goes on in the next paragraph, which we won't read in its entirety, to essentially say, but these things we do now, they're better. Prayer, tefillin, mezuzah, these are better, higher forms of worship than sacrifice in the temple. Why? Because you could only do the sacrifice in one place, only in one location, in one temple, in one specific spot. But prayer and tzitzit and mezuzah and tefillin, these you can do anywhere. So he also, by the way, implies heavily, although he doesn't say it out loud, that God then just allowed the temple to be destroyed so that we could make the transition from animal sacrifice into a form of prayer that was higher, that was portable, that could be carried all over the world, that was more personal, that was in words, that was intellectual, that was spiritual for you as an individual. So now I have to ask us our question again. Does Maimonides want to rebuild the temple? What do you think? I mean, raise your hand if you think Maimonides does want to rebuild the temple. Raise your hand if you think Maimonides doesn't want to rebuild the temple. I see a couple hands for no. I see a couple people that are not so sure, right? Maimonides is very confusing here because on the one hand, he says it's a mitzvah to build a temple. This is a very important central element of Judaism. And on the other hand, he says, but also what we're doing now is better. So Maimonides himself seems to be conflicted about whether he is in mourning for the temple. And in modern times, the reformers, the early reformers of Judaism, so call it mid-19th century, seized upon Maimonides' argument here, especially his second argument, to say, no, this was a sign of progress. God wanted the temple to be destroyed so that we could shift from a form of worship that was lower, that was more animal, that was more primitive, more ancient, to a form of worship that was higher, that was spiritual, that was portable, that can be taken anywhere. Look what Rabbi David Einhorn writes in his 1896 prayer book, which is called, where's my David Einhorn? Hold on. Did I move where this was? Please hold. Here it is. Okay. 1896 prayer book. This is one of the early radical reform prayer books. By the way, this is the prayer book that the Union prayer book was based on. Anybody here grow up in a reform synagogue, in the like the 40s, 50s, 60s? You might remember the old Union prayer book. It wasn't called Old Union at that time. Only when the new Union prayer book was created did we start calling it the Old Union prayer book. Either way, the Old Union prayer book was based on Rabbi David Einhorn's prayer book, which was written originally in German in the 1880s and then translated in 1896. This is the translated version. So this becomes the central idea of Reform Judaism. And what does he say? This is fascinating. The one temple in Jerusalem sank into the dust in order that countless temples might arise to thy glory, thy honor and glory all over the wide surface of the globe. The true and real sanctuary, the imperishable testimony remained ours, untouched and undimmed. In this, our hope, this day of mourning and of fasting hath, according to the word of thy prophet, been turned into a solemn day of rejoicing in view of the glorious destiny of thy law and our high messianic mission, which had its beginning with the historic events which we recall today. So that's a lot of highfalutin language. Does anybody want to translate for us into regular English in your own words what Rabbi Einhorn is saying here? Some confusion out there. Anybody want to take a stab? Marianne, go ahead.
Maybe one thing he's saying, I heard him say, was that this will allow for more synagogues, more temples, more places that we can worship God.
Right. So there used to be just one, and now there are many. He says, the one temple sunk into the dust, so that countless temples that arise. By the way, this is why Reform Jews classically call their synagogues temples, right? Temple-based Israel. I belong to Temple Kol Ami here in Thornhill, in Toronto. You have a Temple Kol Ami in Phoenix as well, for those of you who are from Arizona, right?
Temple
Traditionally,
High.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dania.
No, Temple High is where I go.
Yeah, Temple High, exactly. Temple High, like why is a synagogue a temple? Because the early reformers said, we're not looking to rebuild the temple. We're looking to build our temple right here and now. And this, by the way, is why the sanctuary where I prayed for 4 years as a rabbinical student, together with Rabbi Emily Siegel, by the way, who was my classmate, faced in Cincinnati, Ohio, at Hebrew Union College, faced west, because the reformers of the 1880s, they built their synagogue as a way of saying, we're not looking toward Jerusalem. Cincinnati is our Jerusalem. Phoenix is our Jerusalem. Toronto is our Jerusalem. We will build our temple right here. And so therefore, Rabbi Einhorn says, we ought to be celebrating Tisha B'Av. We ought to turn this day into what he calls a solemn day of rejoicing. We should be happy on Tisha B'Av. Let's celebrate the fact that the temple was destroyed and it gave way to a higher and more spiritual and more modern and more portable and more and maybe even more spiritually evolved form of Judaism. So, all right, how does this resonate? Who's ready to celebrate on Tisha B'Av next week?
Me.
Yeah, Marianne, tell me more. Why do you want to celebrate?
Well, just everything that you said. Now, I mean, if this were the olden days, we wouldn't be there. Americans, we couldn't go to the temple, but now we can. It's great.
Okay, so Tisha B'Av now becomes a day of celebration. Other thoughts? Who else wants to celebrate Tisha B'Av? Or is anybody here feeling some kind of like a twinge of discomfort with the idea of having like a big celebratory feast day on Tisha B'Av? Any thoughts? What are you feeling about all this or thinking about all this? Vanya, go ahead. Am I saying your name correctly, by the way? Oh, you're on mute.
No, you're not saying my name correctly. It's Vanya, like Tanya with a V.
Oh, thank you for correcting me. Vanya, please.
Yes. And what was your question?
The question is, how are we feeling about the idea of celebrating Tisha B'Av versus it being a day of mourning and fasting?
I think we should honor it. I don't think we should go by party favors and everything else, but I think we should solemnly honor it, and we can pray, we can we can celebrate it without all the pizzazz. So we
Mhm.
can celebrate it with
So
our families at the meal, so something like that.
I think I'm hearing you suggest that it be somewhere in sort of like an in-between day, right? That we recognize maybe there's a sadness to recognize,
Mhm.
but also that we don't necessarily look backwards. We recognize that we're not looking back toward the temple per se.
Mhm. Yes.
So thank you. I see Michael, and I think I see Ellen after that. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, I think too, what are we talking about celebrating? Okay, because what we see before even the Roman times, the transition from a sacrifice-based concept to a based upon placing that with relationship with Hashem, and what we see in that relationship, and with the falling of the Roman destruction of the temple and the dispersion, that was reinforced. But even before that, I remember reading what 10% of the Roman Empire were people who proclaimed they were Jewish. And so I think what we need to look at now is the beginning to look at what the next few months are going to be. What is our relationship between us and Hashem? And what is the moral values and strength that we have? And how does that relate to us being Jews, whether Reform, Reconstructionists, whether, how do we contemplate and understand that?
Great. Yeah. So what's the moral message, right? How do we have Tisha B'Av transcend simple mourning for past events and to contain a moral message for our lives today? That's the forward looking, right? That's the Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, renew our days as of old. Where is Tisha B'Av trying to send us? And in a minute, we'll see that the rabbis of the Talmud have the same idea. Ellen, please.
Well, both you and Michael were so eloquent in what you said, so I hope I can just put a little catch to that. It is a solemn day, I still feel, but it's being mindful of the history and yet also hopeful of the fact that as we have brought ourselves from the period of sacrifice into living our mitzvot, whether it be the tefillin or the tzitzit or the prayer, etc., each and every day, we are making a place for Hashem in our hearts and in our world. And so to me, that is the time of rejoicing.
I love it. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, this day is there is what to rejoice about. And yet there's this intense sadness at the same time, because it is a day of such tragedy, right? And so I want to show you how the rabbis deal with that. This is there's a lot more text here, but in the end, I always prepare too much, and that's fine. So this is a story that some of you might know. It comes from the Talmud, Tractate Gittin. This is the famous story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Anybody familiar with that? Does that sound familiar to anybody? No? All right. We're not going to read the whole thing. I'll tell you the story instead. But the Talmud asks the question, why was Jerusalem destroyed? Now, there are a lot of stories the rabbis could have told about why Jerusalem was destroyed, right? We could have blamed the Romans. We could have blamed a lot of people. We could have blamed the Romans, but we didn't. Here's what the rabbis say. They say Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. There was this guy who has a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Bar Kamsa, and he accidentally invites the wrong person to a party. That's the way the story begins. He means to invite Kamsa, and he accidentally invites Bar Kamsa. And when Bar Kamsa shows up, he treats him like dirt. Bar Kamsa comes in, and the guy's like, "What are you doing here? I hate you." And Bar Kamsa says, "Please don't embarrass me. Just let me stay. I'll pay for whatever I eat." And the guy's like, "No way, get out of here." And Bar Kamsa says, "Please, I'll pay for the whole party. Just don't embarrass me in front of this community." And the host, the nameless host of the party, says, "Get out." And he physically throws Bar Kamsa out of the party. Bar Kamsa notices to himself that the rabbis are sitting there and they did not stop him. So he is offended by the community. And he says, "You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go inform against them to the government." And he goes to the Roman government and says, the Jews are rebelling against you. And because of that, the emperor sends Vespasian. Vespasian is the the general who administers the war. This is historical. Whether this part's historical, I couldn't tell you. But this part's historical. Vespasian actually is the general who administers the siege against Jerusalem. And Vespasian comes, and the story now goes that there's multiple parties within the Jews. There's a group of rabbis and a group of zealots, and the rabbis say, let's make peace with the Romans. And the zealots say, no way, we want to overthrow the Romans. And the rabbis say, let's make peace. And the zealots say, no way. And the zealots get up and they burn all the stores of wheat in the city. Now, there was enough foods in the city to last 3 years. But the zealots burned the stores of wheat so that the people would have to fight against the Romans. And moving along, I'm not going to read this whole story. The rabbis end this way. They say, it is taught, Rabbi Elazar says, come and see how great is the power of shame. For the Holy Blessed One came to the aid of Bar Kamsa and destroyed God's own temple and burned God's own sanctuary in order to defend the honor of Bar Kamsa. So like I said, the rabbis could have blamed this on anybody. They could have gotten mad at the Romans. They could have gotten mad at God. Who did they get mad at? Us. They said, we messed this up for ourselves. We mistreated each other. We didn't live up to our own values. We burned our own stores of wheat. We hated one another. We treated our fellow human beings unkindly. God brought this upon us, al chata'enu, for our own sins. Now that's a very uncomfortable idea, that we are suffering for our own punishment. But it's a really interesting idea as well, because, the alternative is God has abandoned you. God abandons you. If your temple is destroyed and you decide God abandons you, then you cease to be Jewish and you abandon God right back. But if your temple is destroyed and you decide that God is punishing you, as uncomfortable as that is, you know what it means? It means you believe God cares about how you act and about you being in covenant with God. So the message here that the rabbis wish to give us is, how you act matters. You bring your own destruction upon yourself. Now, I don't want to go as far as saying every time we suffer, that's because of something we did, right? Like if I get sick, God is punishing me. I can't fathom that idea, especially after the Holocaust, especially in a world where there's sickness and suffering. We can take this too far. But the basic idea that people have agency over what happens in the world, the connection between the moral imperative and the way and what happens in the world is a very important central Jewish idea. So the creation of a new temple now becomes a code word for the creation of a morally just and upright world. What does it mean that the temple is going to be rebuilt? And maybe it doesn't mean that literally the temple will be rebuilt. Maybe it means we will build a world worthy of what it is that God demands of us. We will build a world where we recognize the image of God in all human beings. We will build a world where we recognize that all people are worthy of dignity. We will build a world that is the opposite of the Jerusalem that God itself destroyed 2,000 years ago. And that's the message that the rabbis wish us to take away. And I'll end with one last text, which I think is absolutely gorgeous. And then I'm happy to take if there's any last comments or questions. This is from what's called the Netivot Shalom. Rabbi, his last name is Berzovsky. I think it's Rabbi Shlomo Berzovsky. I believe he's the past Rebbe of Slonim, the Slonimer Rebbe, died maybe in the last 15, 20 years. And this is from his book of sermons for the period of Bein HaMitzarim, the period, this period of mourning that leads up to Tisha B'Av. He says, the meaning of our mourning over the Beit Midrash means the temple, is I-Hashlama. I-Hashlama comes from the word shalom. What does shalom mean? Peace or completion. Not making peace with or not coming to terms. What does it mean that we're in mourning for the temple? It means ihashlama. We are never to come to terms with the destruction of the temple. Let me go back and read that again. The meaning of our mourning over the Beit Midrash is ihashlama, or non-coming to terms with the destruction of the temple, and a longing for rebuilding. The people of Israel are never, even for a moment, to come to terms with the fact that the temple has been destroyed. They should always keep its memory in their hearts and long for it and look forward to the time when it will be rebuilt. But by this, we can understand what the Rebbe of Kubrin teaches, that the worst thing is to become reconciled with the situation as it is. So it's one thing to live in a broken world. We all live in a broken world. It's quite another thing to be okay with living in a broken world, to become reconciled with the idea that you live in a broken world and that's just the way it is. So in the end, the message of Tisha B'Av is a message of tikva. It's a message of hope, that we must be forward-looking. We must never come to terms with the idea or make peace with the idea that the world is just broken and that's the way it is. We must always believe that we have a responsibility to repair and rebuild. And whether that means a literal rebuilding of the temple, that's up to you and your beliefs. But it certainly means that we have a responsibility to repair and rebuild the world that we are living in. So with that, I'll end our discussion. Are we really in mourning for the temple? And if not, what's the point of Tisha B'Av? To me, that's the point of Tisha B'Av. Any last comments or questions in the 1 minute we have left?
Oh, Rabbi, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marianne.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi Streiffer, for this very insightful class. I know Michael had a question in the chat. Was there sacrifice before Moses and the creation of the Jewish people?
Was there sacrifice before Moses? I mean, look, are you asking a historical question or are you asking a question about Torah, right? We know that Abraham sacrificed. We read about Abraham creating altars. So people certainly sacrifice, right? Moses didn't invent sacrifice. If Moses, and now that the Reform rabbi in me comes out, if I get struck by lightning, then none of you will be affected by it because I'm in a different country. If Moses even existed, what Moses does is to channel, and this is what the Rambam is saying, Maimonides is saying, is to channel something that people are familiar with into a new direction, to take sacrifice, which the Egyptians are sacrificing, the Mesopotamians are sacrificing, and to help us channel that toward God. So I would say, yes, there is sacrifice before Moses and the creation of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people have a new take on sacrifice, and then ultimately a new take on worship that leads us to where we are today.
My question is really centered around when, we've always seen that sacrifice was the foundation for Judaism. And my question was, in seeing this in development of Jewish people and emergence, was sacrifice something that emerged in a narrow period, or it really was foundational? Because you don't see reference of it. I guess you do when you talk about the building of the temple and the Kol Ami, they had to eat, but I mean, it's I was just wondering of how foundational it really was, or how early.
Yeah, I mean, I think we know that sacrifice is very, very early. We have archaeological evidence of lots of high places and sacrificial locations, Israelite locations, Judean locations in the land of Israel. And much older than that as well, right? We know that people sacrificed in the ancient world, and the idea that the sacrifice is only to God is if I put on my historical criticism hat for a second, is probably relatively late in Judaism, maybe even post-exilic, right? So the idea that Moses is a monotheist is probably a late idea. But sacrifice itself is very, very old. And the idea that the temple sits at the center of Judaism may even have arisen during the exile, the first exile, when the Jews needed something to rally around, which is the city of Jerusalem and the destroyed temple. And then when they returned after the end of the Babylonian exile, they rebuild the temple, and the temple now sits at the center of Jerusalem. So sacrifice is old, but the idea of a central temple is very possibly more closely associated with exilic Judaism than with something more ancient than that. But I think we're out of time, although I would be happy to talk to you about that for another half hour or so if we had time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Rabbi Streiffer. And I just want to let you all know about the 2 classes we're having next week. So next week with Rabbi Gittler, we're going to be loving the stranger. What, if any, are our obligations to the undocumented on our streets? And then with Rabbi Yaskowitz, unleash your potential. So thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you all have a great day.